Judge Samuel Harris sat at his bench, looking over the case file in front of him with a practiced eye he had honed over the years of presiding over countless cases. From traffic violations to more serious offenses, it had become second nature to him to move through the cases quickly without allowing personal bias to cloud his judgment. Today was no different. He glanced at the clock ticking away in the back of the courtroom, signaling that the next case was due to begin. He turned his attention to the woman standing before him. She was a black woman of about 45, her hair pulled back into a tight, neat bun, her eyes focused straight ahead. As she stood at attention before the judge, no apparent sign of anxiety crossed her features as she quietly awaited the inevitable outcome. He read her name aloud, Jasmine Turner, and the offense for which she was being charged: illegal parking in a restricted zone. She had parked her car in a spot clearly marked with a sign reading "No parking beyond this point." Yet when the parking authorities arrived, they found her car there with no sign of movement from the vehicle or the driver. The charge itself was minor. The fine easily could be paid without much consequence. But Judge Harris had never been one to let such things slide lightly. A fine was necessary for the sake of upholding the law and making an example of those who broke it. After all, no one was above the rules. Jasmine had been caught in a rare instance where the law could not be bent or excused. There were no mitigating factors to her case. She had no valid excuse. She was simply guilty. Judge Harris looked at her across the courtroom from his raised position, his eyes scanning her face as he took in her composed demeanor. Jasmine Turner didn't seem like the kind of person who would let a small fine ruin her day. She stood tall with an air of quiet confidence that had caught the attention of more than a few people in the courtroom. Even now, as he assessed her, he could not detect any hint of discomfort or stress. She was neither pleading for sympathy nor displaying any emotion whatsoever. The judge's brow furrowed slightly, but he gave no indication of his thoughts as he turned his attention back to the case file, reading over her driving record. There was nothing to suggest that she had ever been a problem in the past, no previous violations or fines of note. So why did she seem so calm, so unaffected by the penalty he was about to impose? Surely a person who had never been in trouble would find this situation a bit more distressing, but she didn't flinch at all. Without another moment's hesitation, Judge Harris struck his gavel down firmly on the bench and pronounced the verdict. He issued the fine. That was the end of the matter. As far as he was concerned, the case was closed. The woman would pay the price for her error, and life would continue on as it had before. But there was something about her calm that lingered in the back of his mind. He didn't understand it. Her silence spoke volumes, yet he could not place the reason behind it. Something about the way she carried herself made him uneasy for reasons he couldn't define. He would later realize that it was not the case, but the woman herself who had left an impression on him, something he could not ignore. Jasmine Turner walked out of the courthouse with the same quiet confidence she had entered with. The fine was small, a trivial matter in the grand scheme of her life, and yet the weight of the court's decision, its unspoken assumptions, hung in the air like an unwelcome cloud. She made her way to her car, a sleek black sedan parked neatly in the lot, and slid into the driver's seat without a word. As she drove away from the courthouse, she couldn't help but reflect on how easily the judge had dismissed her case. She wasn't angry, not even irritated. It was just that the judge, like so many others before him, had judged her based on appearance alone. He hadn't looked at her for who she truly was. He had seen only a black woman in a modest outfit standing before him in court, a woman, perhaps, who lacked the power or influence to make a mark on his world. But Jasmine was not the woman the judge had seen. Beneath her composed exterior was a mind that had built an empire, a vast network of businesses that spanned industries from technology to real estate, a collection of assets worth billions of dollars. Over the years, Jasmine had mastered the art of blending in, of remaining invisible to the world at large. She had done so intentionally, carefully navigating a world that often judged her based on her race, her gender, and her appearance. To many, she was just another woman, maybe even another middle-class citizen working her way through life. But in reality, she had created something entirely different. A business empire that placed her in the rarefied air of the ultra-wealthy, a place that most people would never even dream of reaching. Her wealth had not come from inherited fortune or sheer luck. No, Jasmine had worked for everything she had. She had started from scratch in a small apartment, using her skills in tech development and real estate to gradually build a reputation for herself in a world that wasn't always kind to ambitious women, especially women of color. She had faced resistance at every turn, but she had never let it stop her. With each challenge, she had only grown stronger, more determined to succeed. Yet, despite her incredible success, Jasmine had chosen to keep a low profile. She never flaunted her wealth. She didn't live in a mansion or drive flashy cars. Instead, she lived simply, blending in with the crowd, quietly using her resources to fund charities, support education initiatives, and create opportunities for others who were often overlooked. She preferred it this way, not because she was ashamed of her success, but because she understood the power of being underestimated. The world, she knew, often mistook humility for weakness. It was a tool she wielded expertly, letting others underestimate her while she built her influence in silence. As Jasmine drove through the city, she considered the events of the day. She hadn't planned on revealing who she truly was, not yet. There was no need for it. The fine was a minor annoyance, not something worth turning into a spectacle. But now, with the media picking up the story, she knew that things were about to change. The world was about to discover the woman who had built a fortune from the ground up, a woman who had lived among them unnoticed. She wasn't sure what the reaction would be, but she was ready. People had already begun to question why she hadn't made a scene in court. They'd wonder why someone with her wealth would care about something so trivial. But Jasmine knew better than anyone that appearances could be deceiving. The judge hadn't seen her for who she was, and soon neither would the rest of the world. The storm was just beginning. The news broke faster than anyone could have expected. What began as a simple local story about a woman fined for parking illegally quickly spiraled into something much more explosive when journalists began digging into the background of Jasmine Turner. It started with a few simple questions. Who was she? What did she do for a living? And how had someone so composed and unbothered by such a minor infraction ended up in court? The local paper, curious about the woman's story, began to investigate. What they found stunned everyone. Jasmine Turner was no ordinary woman. She wasn't just a small business owner or a local professional. She was a self-made billionaire. The details of her fortune were staggering. Over the past 2 decades, Jasmine had built an empire spanning multiple industries: technology, real estate, and even renewable energy. She had founded several successful companies, many of which had revolutionized niche markets. Her investments in high-growth startups had turned her into a respected figure in Silicon Valley, and her real estate ventures across the country were worth billions. She was a silent force in the business world, staying out of the public eye while amassing one of the largest fortunes in the country. As the news of her wealth spread, so did the questions. Why hadn't she ever made a public appearance? Why had she remained so secretive about her success? The more people learned, the more curious they became. The media frenzy quickly shifted from the mundane issue of a parking violation to something far more complex. Who was this woman, and why was she hiding in plain sight? The story was everywhere. Local news stations picked it up, followed by national outlets that couldn't get enough of the mystery surrounding Jasmine Turner. Headlines read, "Billionaire woman caught parking illegally, and judge fines woman who's worth billions. What was he thinking?" The public's reaction was immediate and polarized. Some viewed her as an enigma, fascinated by the idea that someone with so much power and influence could remain so humble and low-key. Others, however, couldn't help but question her motives. Why would a billionaire woman be involved in such a trivial case? Was she trying to prove a point, or was it just an unfortunate oversight? For Jasmine, the media storm was both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, she had never sought attention, and this kind of exposure was both overwhelming and unwelcome. On the other hand, it gave her an unprecedented platform to influence the public discourse about race, wealth, and justice. Her story, once limited to boardrooms and business deals, had now become a national conversation. The issues of racial prejudice in the legal system and the disparity between the wealthy and the average citizen had come into sharp focus. People were now asking whether the judge had treated her differently because of her race, and whether her apparent modesty had led him to underestimate her. Yet despite the swirling media circus, Jasmine maintained a composed silence. She didn't respond to interviews or make any public statements. Instead, her legal team prepared a carefully crafted response, one that would be more than just about the parking fine. They were gearing up to reveal a deeper issue: the inherent biases in the legal system and how easily assumptions were made based on appearances alone. It was time for her to reveal herself fully, not just as a businesswoman, but as a symbol of something much larger. She wasn't just a billionaire hiding in plain sight. She was a force of change, one who had been quietly breaking down barriers in a system that wasn't built for people like her. The nation watched closely as Jasmine's story began to unfold. The judge, once so confident in his decision, now found himself under intense scrutiny. The case was no longer about a simple parking violation. It had become a national symbol of inequality, of race and class, and of the assumptions that guide our perceptions. The question remained: how would this revelation affect the judge's decision, and what would the public make of the woman who had been underestimated for so long? The stage was set, and the world was waiting for the next move. Judge Samuel Harris could feel the weight of the storm pressing down on him. The morning after the news of Jasmine Turner's wealth broke, he sat in his chambers, his mind consumed by the headlines. He had barely slept. The images of the composed woman in his courtroom, her calm demeanor, and the fine he had imposed on her, those thoughts kept circling in his mind like a relentless tide. He had always prided himself on being fair, on making decisions based solely on the law and not on personal biases. But now, with Jasmine's true identity revealed to the world, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had made a grave mistake. Judge Harris was no stranger to criticism. He had presided over countless high-profile cases and had built a reputation for being tough but fair. But this was different. This case wasn't about a technicality or a small legal misstep. No, this was about something deeper, something he had failed to see when he first issued the fine. Jasmine Turner, it seemed, was not just any defendant. She was a woman whose life and experiences were entirely different from what he had assumed in that brief moment in the courtroom. The judge had made his decision quickly, perhaps too quickly. He had been caught up in the routine of the day, thinking of her as just another case, another person to fine, another case to close. But now, faced with the truth of who Jasmine was, Harris felt something inside him stir, a discomfort, a doubt. Was he guilty of judging her based on her race, on her quiet, unassuming appearance? His internal struggle was palpable. Could he have been influenced by the fact that she was a black woman, standing in front of him with no airs of entitlement? Was he subconsciously dismissing her, assuming that someone who appeared so ordinary couldn't possibly be extraordinary? The weight of this realization hit him harder than any legal brief he had ever read. His mind flashed back to the moments in court when he had watched Jasmine. There was nothing about her that stood out. She wasn't wearing expensive clothing. She didn't carry herself with the arrogance of someone accustomed to power. Instead, she had been quiet, reserved, almost unremarkable. But now he wondered, had that been part of her strategy? Had she wanted to avoid standing out, to be seen as just another person, instead of a woman whose name and wealth could change the world? The judge felt himself growing more conflicted by the hour. In his mind, the case had shifted from a simple parking violation to a profound moral dilemma. Judge Harris found himself poring over the details of Jasmine's life, not out of curiosity, but because he needed to understand. He had to know who she was to try and grasp the full scope of her achievements and the context of her wealth. The more he learned, the more ashamed he became. Jasmine Turner had spent her life quietly breaking barriers in a world that wasn't built for people like her. She had fought through discrimination, systemic obstacles, and prejudice to build something that many could only dream of. And yet, in that courtroom, she had been reduced to just another defendant. The realization that he had played a part in dismissing her because of her race, because of the assumptions he had made, gnawed at him. He had always prided himself on his fairness, on his ability to separate emotion from the law. But now, Harris was questioning whether he had allowed his subconscious biases to cloud his judgment. He could not escape the growing sense of guilt. This was more than a case now. It was a moment of reckoning, not just for Jasmine Turner, but for himself. He had to decide whether he would continue to hide behind the guise of legal objectivity or whether he would confront the uncomfortable truth that he, too, had been part of the problem. The days following Jasmine's revelation were long and filled with inner turmoil for the judge. He knew he had to make a decision, one that would reflect not just his understanding of the law, but his understanding of the world around him. Would he acknowledge the bias, or would he pretend it didn't exist? The public was waiting, and so was Jasmine Turner. Jasmine Turner's legal team wasted no time in preparing their case. What began as a simple dispute over a parking ticket had quickly escalated into a matter of national significance. Her lawyer, a sharp and seasoned litigator named Derek Williams, knew this case wasn't just about a fine. It was about something much bigger: the systemic bias that permeated the legal system and the deeply ingrained prejudices that influenced decisions, even in the most seemingly objective environments. The lawsuit that Jasmine's team filed went beyond the grounds of the parking violation. It was a statement, a challenge to the assumptions that had led to the fine being imposed in the first place. Derek, along with his colleagues, framed the case as a broader conversation about racial and economic discrimination within the judicial system. They argued that Jasmine's treatment in court had been influenced by her race and her outward appearance, as well as the presiding judge's failure to consider her true identity. Jasmine had known from the start that the court's decision wasn't just about a parking ticket. It was a reflection of the biases that so often shaped how Black women, particularly successful ones, were perceived in America. She wasn't surprised when the media focused on her wealth. After all, the news outlets were always hungry for a sensational story. But what surprised her was the outpouring of support from people who saw her as a symbol of resistance against the stereotypical assumptions placed on people of color. Some commentators began to ask whether Judge Harris had fined her because she didn't fit the mold of a typical defendant, someone poor, struggling, or in need of sympathy. Her composed, quiet nature, combined with her race, had likely led him to assume she didn't belong in his court on equal footing. The media was full of opinions, and social media exploded with hashtags calling for justice. People debated whether it was possible for someone like Jasmine to be treated fairly in a system that so often seemed to penalize those who didn't conform to the dominant social and racial narrative. Her legal team quickly realized that the lawsuit had struck a nerve. What began as a case about a single fine had turned into a powerful conversation about the relationship between race, class, and justice. Jasmine herself, however, remained largely silent, letting her legal team handle the public relations aspect. She was aware that her every move was being watched, and while she was deeply committed to the cause, she preferred to stay out of the spotlight. She wasn't interested in becoming a media figure. Instead, she wanted the focus to remain on the issue at hand. The fine wasn't the real problem. It was the larger issue of unequal treatment within the system. She hoped that by pursuing this case, she could shine a light on the experiences of those who didn't have the platform or resources to challenge the injustices they faced. Judge Harris, meanwhile, had found himself under increasing pressure. As the case gained momentum, he began receiving letters and emails from across the country, some offering support while others criticized his actions. His name was now synonymous with the controversy, and his once unshakable reputation was being questioned by the public. He had always prided himself on being a man of integrity, but the doubt that now clouded his conscience was hard to ignore. Could he really have been impartial when he passed judgment on Jasmine Turner? The stakes were high. This case was no longer just about righting a wrong. It was about addressing deep-seated biases within the judicial system, the way society viewed race and wealth, and whether those in power could truly be fair when faced with someone who didn't fit the mold. As the days passed, both sides prepared for what was sure to be a landmark legal battle that would be closely followed by the nation. Jasmine's team was determined to make a statement. They weren't just fighting for her. This case was for everyone who had been treated unfairly simply because of who they were or how they appeared. And Judge Harris, as he reflected on the growing storm around him, knew that his decision in the coming weeks would not only define his career, but also send a message about the future of justice in America. The day of the trial arrived, and the courthouse was packed. It wasn't just the local community that had come to witness the proceedings. This case had drawn national attention. Journalists from major news outlets filled the courtroom, along with activists, legal experts, and ordinary citizens eager to see the outcome of this landmark case. The eyes of the country were fixed on the courtroom, where the tension was palpable. This wasn't merely a case about parking fine anymore. It had become a symbol of everything wrong with the judicial system's treatment of marginalized communities, especially when those communities were also wealthy and powerful. Jasmine Turner arrived early, her usual calm demeanor in place. She wore a simple but elegant suit, her hair carefully styled. Despite the press buzzing around her, she moved with purpose, her face giving little away. She was here for justice, not spectacle, and she had made it clear from the beginning that her fight was about more than just herself. It was about the biases that had been baked into the system for far too long. Judge Samuel Harris entered the courtroom shortly before the proceedings were set to begin. The weight of the moment seemed to settle on his shoulders as he took his seat. He had been facing increasing pressure to recuse himself from the case, given the media frenzy and the questions surrounding his previous ruling. But he had chosen not to step aside. He knew that in many ways, this case was now about him as much as it was about Jasmine Turner. He had made a decision based on assumptions that he was beginning to regret, and now he had to face the consequences. The trial began with a straightforward recounting of the facts. Jasmine Turner had parked in a restricted area, and she had been fined. There were no disputes about the facts themselves. However, the defense, led by Derek Williams, wasted no time in introducing the deeper issues at play. They argued that the fine had been unjustly levied because Judge Harris had failed to consider the larger context. He had not taken into account who Jasmine Turner was, the woman behind the legal case, the billionaire entrepreneur whose contributions to society had never been acknowledged. Instead, he had judged her based on her outward appearance, an unassuming, black woman who didn't fit the stereotypical image of someone in her position. Derek began by presenting a series of articles, interviews, and testimonies about Jasmine's achievements. He painted a picture of a woman who had broken down barriers in a world that often wasn't kind to people of color, let alone black women. He showed the courtroom how Jasmine's wealth wasn't the result of family inheritance, but of decades of hard work, perseverance, and a commitment to creating businesses that not only succeeded but transformed industries. He highlighted her philanthropic efforts, her work in providing scholarships to underprivileged students, and her commitment to environmental sustainability. But the most poignant part of his argument came when he discussed the judge's role in the case. Derek reminded the court that Judge Harris had not taken the time to understand Jasmine's background, nor had he questioned why such a woman would be in his courtroom for something as trivial as a parking violation. He asked the judge, in front of the entire court, how he could justify imposing a fine on someone who had contributed so much to society, while at the same time failing to see her as more than just another black woman before him. The defense's argument was powerful. The courtroom fell silent as Derek's words settled in the air. Jasmine Turner, seated at the defense table, remained stoic, her face unreadable. But inside, she could feel the weight of the moment. This wasn't just a legal battle. It was a fight for recognition, for the acknowledgement of the unseen struggles of black women in America. It was a fight against the biases that had been so deeply ingrained in society that they often went unnoticed, even by those who thought themselves to be fair and just. The prosecution, representing the state, had a much simpler task: to defend the fine. They argued that the law was the law, and that the case should be treated as any other. They didn't engage in the larger conversation about race or bias, instead focusing on the fact that Jasmine had violated a clear regulation. But even they seemed aware that this case had transcended the simple nature of the offense. Judge Harris, watching the proceedings unfold, felt the weight of every word. He had never imagined that a simple parking violation would lead to this kind of national reckoning. The questions that Derek had raised about his actions echoed in his mind. Could he defend his decision, knowing now the full extent of who Jasmine Turner really was? Could he continue to ignore the biases that had influenced him, even unconsciously? As the day's proceedings drew to a close, the courtroom was left in suspense. The nation, it seemed, was holding its breath. Everyone knew that whatever the verdict, it would not just affect Jasmine Turner. It would send a message about the future of justice in America and about how the law treated those who were too often overlooked. The stage was set for a dramatic conclusion, and no one knew what would happen next. The following morning, Judge Samuel Harris sat alone in his chambers, his fingers tapping restlessly against his desk. He had been wrestling with his conscience for days now, unable to shake the deep discomfort that had settled in his gut since the trial. The courtroom had been filled with tension as Derek Williams, Jasmine's attorney, laid out the powerful arguments that had changed the course of the case. He had laid bare the assumptions that the judge had made, revealing how quickly and unconsciously bias had colored his judgment. Harris had been forced to confront not just his own actions, but the larger issues of race and wealth that the case had brought to light. For the first time in his career, Judge Harris felt uncertain. He had always prided himself on making decisions based purely on the law. He had never thought of himself as prejudiced, but now, with the weight of Jasmine Turner's story pressing on him, he couldn't help but wonder. Had he let the societal biases that shaped the world around him influence his decision that day? Had he looked at a woman who appeared ordinary, calm, and unassuming, and assumed she was just another defendant, unworthy of deeper consideration? The judge leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes, remembering the day Jasmine had stood before him in court. Her demeanor had been nothing out of the ordinary. She wasn't flashy, and she hadn't put on a show. In fact, it was the very fact that she didn't seem to fit the mold of a stereotypical wealthy person that had perhaps led him to dismiss her. She had been polite, composed, and humble in her demeanor, as if she had no real expectation of special treatment. It had been easy to overlook her. Now he couldn't help but ask himself whether his ruling had been influenced by these assumptions. Had he, without realizing it, dismissed the complexity of her situation and judged her as he might judge anyone who did not fit the expected profile of a powerful, influential person? And if he had, did that mean he had been a part of the very system of injustice he had spent years trying to uphold? In his mind, the case had transformed from a simple legal matter into a moral and ethical dilemma. It was no longer just about whether Jasmine had broken the law. It was about the broader implications of how people were treated based on who they were, how they looked, and how society saw them. It was about confronting the biases, both subtle and overt, that shaped every decision, every judgment, and every encounter in his courtroom. The pressure mounted. The public was clamoring for a decision, for an answer that would either validate or challenge the assumptions they had made about the case. Judge Harris knew that his ruling would carry far more weight than just the outcome of one individual's legal case. It would reflect his understanding of justice, fairness, and the power dynamics at play in the courtroom. When the day of the verdict arrived, the courtroom was filled once again, the air heavy with anticipation. Journalists crowded in the back, their cameras poised. Activists stood outside, holding signs, while ordinary citizens awaited the decision with bated breath. Jasmine Turner entered, her posture straight, her face calm. She was prepared for whatever came next, knowing that the outcome would shape not just her life, but the narrative around race, wealth, and justice in America. Judge Harris stepped onto the bench, his gavel in hand, his face set in solemn resolve. He had thought long and hard about what to say. This wasn't just about a fine anymore. It was about recognizing the deeper truths that had been revealed over the past few days. He had spent hours reflecting on his actions, on the assumptions that had guided him, and on the biases that had influenced his judgment. It was time for him to make a decision that would, in some way, reflect the very heart of what justice should be. I have carefully considered the arguments presented by both sides. Judge Harris began, his voice steady. This case has illuminated the complexities of how the law is applied and how biases, both seen and unseen, can affect our decisions. He paused, his eyes briefly meeting Jasmine's calm gaze before he continued. Based on the facts and after reflecting on the broader issues raised during this trial, I find that the fine imposed was unjust, and I hereby dismiss the charge. Furthermore, I apologize to Ms. Turner for the assumption that led to the ruling. Justice is not only about following the law, it is about understanding the full picture of who people are and seeing them as they truly are. The room was silent for a moment, and then a wave of murmurs spread through the crowd. For some, the judge's words were a relief. For others, it was a revelation. Judge Harris had not only dismissed the fine, but had acknowledged the deeper implications of his actions. He had admitted to his own shortcomings, and in doing so, had taken the first step toward confronting the biases that had shaped his decisions. Jasmine Turner sat quietly, absorbing the moment. She had fought not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been judged unfairly because of who they were. She knew that this decision was just a small step in a larger journey, but it was a significant one. In that moment, she had not only won her case, she had forced a reckoning that would resonate far beyond this courtroom. The days following the judge's ruling were filled with mixed reactions, but one thing was undeniable. The impact of the case reverberated far beyond the walls of the courtroom. The headlines screamed about Judge Harris's unprecedented admission of bias and his decision to dismiss Jasmine Turner's fine. Some hailed it as a bold step toward confronting the deep-seated racial and economic injustices that pervaded the legal system, while others criticized it as a sign of weakness and political correctness. But for Jasmine, the outcome had never been about winning the legal battle alone. It had always been about making a statement and starting a conversation. Jasmine Turner had never craved the spotlight, but she understood the power of visibility. When the ruling came down, she didn't speak to the media at first. Instead, she focused on her next steps, knowing that her fight wasn't over. The world had watched the case unfold, and now it was time to use this moment to push for deeper systemic change. For the first time, she began speaking openly about her own experiences with bias, not just in the courtroom but throughout her life. As a Black woman who had built her empire from the ground up, she knew what it was like to be underestimated, overlooked, and judged by standards that didn't reflect her true worth. Her words began to resonate. Soon, she was invited to speak at universities, corporate boardrooms, and activist gatherings. Jasmine became a voice for those who had been marginalized, especially women of color, who were often doubly impacted by systemic racism and sexism. She used her platform to advocate for diversity in business, increased opportunities for Black entrepreneurs, and most importantly, a more inclusive legal system. Judge Samuel Harris, meanwhile, found himself grappling with the fallout from his decision. The public had scrutinized him from every angle, and while many praised his willingness to acknowledge his own biases, others felt that his admission had undermined the sanctity of his position. Harris had been a respected judge for years, but now he was a figure of controversy. However, the weeks following the verdict gave him time to reflect deeply on his own role in the justice system. He attended seminars on racial bias and inequality, and for the first time, he sought out discussions with those whose voices were often marginalized. The conversation with Jasmine Turner, whether he realized it or not, had opened a door for him to examine his own prejudices, and he was determined to make real changes in his career. Jasmine's legal victory also triggered a wave of lawsuits from other individuals who felt they had been unfairly treated by the system. Inspired by her case, people began to speak out about the ways they had been wrongly judged or dismissed because of their race, gender, or appearance. Legal scholars began to explore how the judicial system might be reformed to ensure fairness, even in situations where people, like Jasmine, didn't fit the stereotypical image of power. In the months following the trial, Jasmine Turner's business ventures continued to thrive, but now they were underscored by a sense of purpose that went beyond profit. She focused her energy on creating new initiatives aimed at empowering young women of color to enter industries where they had been historically excluded. Her foundation, which had always given back to the community, shifted its focus toward creating scholarships for Black women, pursuing careers in law, business, and technology. She also began collaborating with other powerful women in the tech and finance sectors, advocating for inclusive hiring practices and equal opportunities for all. While the world continued to watch, Jasmine remained steadfast. Her victory in the courtroom was only the beginning. She knew that change wasn't going to happen overnight, but with each small victory, whether in the form of a new law, a scholarship, or an empowered voice, she felt a sense of fulfillment that surpassed any financial gain she could achieve. Judge Harris, too, had started down a new path. He had made a public commitment to reevaluate how he approached cases and how he interacted with defendants who didn't fit the standard image of a wealthy, influential individual. He even began working closely with community organizations to better understand the struggles faced by those who were often left behind by the system. His reputation might have been tarnished, but he was determined to rebuild it by showing that his commitment to justice was still unwavering. For Jasmine, the case had been a turning point, not just in her own life, but in the way society viewed race, wealth, and justice. She had faced down the biases of a system that had often worked against people like her, and in doing so, she had become an unexpected catalyst for change. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like the world was starting to listen. The true measure of her victory wasn't in the court ruling. It was in the conversation that had begun to shift in the hearts and minds that were opening to the possibility of a fairer, more just future. Jasmine Turner had shown the world that the law was not infallible, but with enough courage, one person could make a difference.